Today we'll be talking about two real cave disasters. Stories of ordinary trips that turned into terrifying battles for survival deep underground. In one, a group descends into a narrow shaft, only for two men to vanish in the dark. In the other, a father leads scouts into a cave, unaware he's heading straight into a deadly trap. Both stories take place in tight, freezing spaces where panic rises and time runs out. These aren't just accidents. They're true reminders of how quickly the earth can turn against you. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Beneath a quiet farm near Mount Gambier lies the Shaft, a 393-foot deep sinkhole discovered when a horse vanished into the earth. Its entrance opens into a pitch-black labyrinth of underwater caves that twist in total silence. No light, no sound, only cold stone pressing from all sides and the echo of your breath. For four friends, it began as an exciting adventure, a plan to conquer two legendary caves on opposite sides of the world. Kevin, Philip, Tony, and Douglas had spent years diving together, exploring reefs, wrecks, and hidden chambers deep below the surface. Their journey would start in California's Moaning Cavern, a vertical drop so deep it swallows sound, then end in South Australia's infamous Shaft, a tight water-filled labyrinth hidden beneath flat farmland. But as they descended into the first cave, disaster struck. Philip slipped and fell hard, his leg broken in the cold darkness. With no way to climb out alone, his friends worked together, rigging makeshift splints and lifting him inch by inch toward the surface. While Philip was left behind to recover, the remaining three prepared for the next dive, unaware of the nightmare that waited below. It was 10:05 a.m. Sunlight filtered faintly through the small surface opening, casting a pale beam onto the rocky water below. The air smelled faintly metallic, silent, still. Philip remained behind on the surface, monitoring from topside. The other three divers dropped into the shaft one by one. Kevin first, slipping into the water with calm precision. Then Douglas. Then Tony. Each diver was equipped with a full face mask, double tanks, wrist-mounted dive computers, and high-powered torches clipped to their chest harnesses. The gear hissed and clicked as they adjusted buoyancy and descended slowly into the depths. The main guideline, their lifeline, stretched out before them like a glowing thread in the darkness. They followed it closely, staying shoulder to shoulder. The cave walls were rough and narrow, slick with moisture. Bubbles trailed upward in slow spirals, catching the light before fading into shadow. Every movement stirred up silt, creating a fog that threatened to swallow them whole if they weren't careful. At around 118 feet, they reached a T-shaped intersection, two large tunnels yawning left and right from a central rock mound. Kevin motioned for a brief pause. The divers hovered silently in the water, lights sweeping across the stone. That's when Tony spotted it. A jump reel. A thin spool of guideline tethered loosely to a rock, left behind by a previous diver. That wasn't supposed to be there. Jump reels are used to explore side passages off the main route, but they're never supposed to be abandoned. Kevin hovered closer, examining it. The line was still taut, leading into darkness. It meant someone had gone exploring and hadn't retrieved their equipment. The cave didn't just hold water, it held questions. But the team knew better than to follow an unknown path. Kevin gave a sharp hand signal and they resumed their original route. They descended further to 147 feet, navigating around jagged walls and narrow chambers no wider than a kitchen doorway. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. Visibility shrank. The light from above had completely vanished. Kevin glanced at his gauge, then turned to the others. It was time. He signaled the ascent. The return began slowly. Kevin took the lead, kicking steadily upward. His torch cut a narrow path through the black. Douglas followed just behind, and Tony brought up the rear. Their lights flickered over the walls, catching flashes of old ropes, silt-covered ledges, and the occasional glint of metal embedded in the rock. Soon, they approached the same T-intersection they'd passed earlier. The way out was a simple right turn, back to the main guideline, back toward the light. But the underwater world doesn't always allow for simple decisions. Douglas had begun to drift. He kicked unevenly, his body tilting at a strange angle. Something wasn't right. His buoyancy control device, essential for staying neutrally balanced in the water, was malfunctioning. He struggled to maintain level position, rising too fast or sinking too low with each breath and movement. Then it happened. Douglas's fins brushed the cave floor. A dull thump, a cloud of chaos. The moment his gear made contact, the bottom erupted. A dark wave of silt and fine mud exploded upward, swirling like smoke. The crystal clear water turned into thick brown soup. Visibility dropped from several feet to just inches. Tony froze. Kevin, seeing the danger unfold, immediately grabbed the main guideline, a taut rope running through the center of the cave. It was the only thing that could guide them out now. He held on tight, trying to stay still and avoid stirring the water further. He glanced back and gave the signal to ascend. One sharp hand motion, then another. Instead of following Kevin to the right, the safe route out, Douglas and Tony veered left. Kevin didn't notice at first. He assumed they were right behind him, but Douglas and Tony were gone, drawn into the wrong tunnel, swallowed by the murk. That left passage was narrower, far narrower. It wasn't part of the main circuit. It was a side passage used only by advanced cave divers with side mount configurations, a more compact gear setup designed for tight squeezes. Douglas wasn't prepared for that kind of passage, and worse, he was still unstable. As they moved deeper into the side tunnel, Douglas kicked again. Another mistake. The silt stirred violently around them. The walls felt closer now, like a throat narrowing with every inch forward. Then came the tug. Douglas's front-mounted stage cylinder, a backup tank strapped to his chest, had snagged. The metal valve had looped around part of the guideline running along the tunnel wall. His gloved hands fumbled with the strap, trying to free himself in near-zero visibility. Every movement only kicked up more silt. Despite Douglas's efforts to keep moving, the tension on the line became too much and it finally snapped. A section of the line now dangled from his gear, trailing behind him. It quickly became clear they had lost their link to the main guideline. Without it, they had no reliable path to find the exit, and the silt-filled water made retracing their steps nearly impossible. Douglas and Tony realized the awful truth. They had gone the wrong way and missed the main exit. The tunnel around them had become a shapeless world of darkness. The silt hung in the water like smoke in the air, thick and unrelenting. Their lights barely pierced more than a few inches ahead. Still, they tried. Douglas and Tony moved side by side, hands outstretched, feeling along the rough cave walls. They hoped to find another line, a marker, a sign, anything pointing to the way out. But there was nothing. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe 10. It was hard to tell in the dark. Then came the hardest decision. Abort the dive. Turn back. But when they turned, something far worse had happened. They had lost each other. In the fog of mud and silt, their dive lights didn't connect. Their hands didn't find one another. The cave had swallowed them whole, each diver now alone in a pitch-black maze. Tony tried to reverse, scraping along the tunnel, breathing heavier. His bubbles echoed sharply off the narrow stone. Douglas, now on his own, felt the crushing pressure of isolation. No sound, no light, just the cold stone pressing in. The tunnel grew tighter. They had to wriggle sideways, shoulders twisting against jagged rock. The walls felt wet like the inside of a throat. Every inch forward was a battle. And then came the realization that chilled their blood. Their air was running out. They could feel it. Breaths becoming more shallow, the hiss of their regulators more urgent. Their main tanks were nearly dry. Worse, the cramped space made it impossible to reach the second regulator on their stage cylinders. Their backup air supply was just inches away, but completely out of reach in the narrow confines. They were blind, disoriented, trapped, and now running out of time. Above the surface, at the cave's lonely opening, Kevin broke through the water and climbed out. His suit dripping, mask still on. Philip was already there, waiting near the edge, scanning the hole anxiously. When Philip told him that Douglas and Tony hadn't surfaced yet, Kevin's stomach dropped. A wave of guilt hit him. He realized he shouldn't have started his ascent so quickly. He should have waited at the T-junction when he was still holding onto the guideline, just a little longer to make sure his friends were right behind him. Now, unsure of their condition or location, Kevin felt a growing responsibility. He was determined to go back in and do everything he could to find them and bring them out safely. Without wasting time, Kevin geared back up and dove in again. He retraced his earlier route, keeping a firm grip on the guideline. The cave's silence was deep and steady, broken only by the gentle hiss of his regulator and the distant tapping of his fins. When he reached the T-junction, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The area was completely clouded with silt. What had been a visible path earlier was now a dense fog of muddy water. His dive light struggled to cut through it. Kevin hovered in place and checked several side passages, thinking Douglas and Tony might have taken a wrong turn. He was cautious, never letting go of the line. He searched for several minutes, carefully scanning the limited visibility. But there was no sign of movement, no bubbles, no silhouettes. Just silt and rock. His air supply was getting low. He was now in his reserve tank. Staying any longer would be risky. As a last effort, he used the back of his diving knife to gently tap against his tank, a technique divers use to signal through sound. He paused, listening, then tapped again. He repeated this for several minutes, hoping they might hear him and swim toward the sound. But there was no response. Eventually, Kevin had to make the difficult decision to return to the surface. When only Kevin surfaced, Philip's heart sank. His friends, Douglas and Tony, were still somewhere in the cave below. Panic gripped him. He knew the risks, and every passing second felt heavier. Without wasting time, Philip and Kevin moved swiftly into action. They activated the emergency plan they had all discussed before the dive. Kevin, still catching his breath, described everything he remembered. He explained how the visibility had dropped to near zero and how Douglas and Tony may have taken a wrong turn at the T intersection. He suspected they might have followed the wrong line, possibly the same abandoned one they'd noticed earlier. Authorities were notified immediately. The rescue team didn't delay. Within hours, 4 experienced divers arrived at the site, their gear clinking softly as they prepared to enter the dark water. They were briefed thoroughly, reviewing maps of the cave and Kevin's recollections. Then, one by one, they disappeared into the shaft. Inside the cave, conditions were difficult. The water was thick with silt, stirred up from earlier dives, and it clung to every surface. The rescuers had to move slowly, gently sweeping their lights through the murky tunnel ahead. They looked for signs, scratches on rocks, broken line, or bubbles trapped against the ceiling. It was silent except for the hiss of air from their tanks and the occasional metallic tap against stone. Then they found something, a thin, torn guideline floating loosely like a thread in the current. It confirmed Kevin's fear. The missing divers had followed the wrong path. The broken line led into a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a diver to squeeze through. Visibility here was near zero, and the walls pressed in tightly. After hours of searching, the team had to abort. The silt was too dense, and navigating blindly in such tight conditions was too dangerous. The divers surfaced, frustrated but determined to return. For the next 2 days, the search continued. The team rotated shifts, hoping the sediment would settle. And then, on the 3rd day, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Around 32 feet into a tight side passage, one typically reserved for expert divers using side mount gear, they found Tony. He was wedged in a space so tight it was clear he had struggled. His position suggested he had been trying to escape, but the tunnel gave him no room to move. The rescue divers tried multiple times over 2 days to retrieve his body, but the confined space and poor visibility made it impossible. Though they had located Tony, they couldn't bring him back. Douglas, however, was still missing. After days of exhausting effort and no sign of Douglas, the local team made the difficult decision to pause their recovery operation. Recognizing the extreme difficulty of the cave conditions, tight spaces, zero visibility, and unstable terrain, the authorities called in 3 elite cave divers. These were specialists, divers trained to work in complex recovery missions under the most challenging underwater environments. The new team wasted no time. On their first recovery dive, they carried with them a custom-made harness, designed to gently secure and extract a body from a narrow tunnel without causing further disturbance. The divers worked in near-total darkness, their headlamps cutting through cloudy water like thin beams of moonlight. One diver held the harness line steady while another carefully removed small rocks and debris blocking the way. Every move had to be slow and deliberate. In such tight quarters, even a misplaced fin could send clouds of silt swirling. But after hours of methodical effort, they managed to ease Tony's body free from the passage. Divers waiting in the wider part of the cave helped guide the harness upward, gently bringing Tony's body back to the surface. The full recovery took nearly 5 hours. The next day, the expert team prepared for another dive, this time to search for Douglas. They descended past the spot where Tony had been found, deeper into the same narrow tunnel. Visibility was poor, and the walls seemed to press in tighter with each foot. One diver pushed 39 feet farther into the passage, making it a total of 72 feet in. And there, in the dim glow of his torch, he found Douglas. Douglas was facing him, motionless, caught in a narrow bend of the tunnel. To begin recovery, the diver first removed the cylinder from Douglas's back. As soon as it was released, it floated upward, a clear sign that it was empty. Next, he carefully cut away the front-mounted cylinder. This one sank slowly, indicating it was still full of unused air. It was entangled in a large mass of cave line, likely the same line Douglas had accidentally dragged with him during his attempt to find a way out. The diver worked patiently, removing the mess of knotted guideline and freeing Douglas's gear. Once the body was moved back to the same chamber where Tony had been recovered, they used the same harness and retrieval process. This second recovery mission took around 6 hours. In the end, 2 promising young men, Douglas and Tony, lost their lives in pursuit of their shared passion. Their loss left a lasting mark on their friends, families, and the entire diving community, a reminder that even the most experienced adventurers are not immune to the dangers hidden deep below the surface. But the underground world continues to call to those seeking challenge, discovery, or simply a day of adventure. And for one group of Boy Scouts, that's exactly what it was supposed to be. It was March 27th, 1982. Donald Wellner and his sons were filled with excitement for the caving trip he had carefully planned. What none of them knew was that nature had something else in store. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, 42-year-old Scoutmaster Donald Wellner arrived with his 2 sons, Christopher and Roger. Together, they were helping lead a group of 12 eager Boy Scouts into the Crooked Swamp cave system in New Jersey. Donald had guided many caving trips over the past year, and his sons had grown confident in exploring underground spaces. This was familiar ground for them. Joining them was another experienced Scoutmaster, Jim, who had teamed up with Donald to help manage the group. Before entering, they gathered the boys and laid down the ground rules. Stay together, never leave your buddy, only explore areas approved by the Scoutmasters. The boys listened carefully. For many, this would be their first time entering a real cave. From above ground, the entrance was barely noticeable. A narrow slit in the earth only 16 inches high and 28 inches wide, partly hidden by moss and dry leaves. Anyone walking by might mistake it for a small animal den. But this tiny crack was the gateway to an entire underground maze. The boys lined up one by one, crawling in on hands and knees, their helmets scraping gently against the low limestone ceiling. The first squeeze was a test of nerves. Some of the boys laughed nervously while others hesitated, gripping the cool, damp rocks with uncertain fingers. Inside, the narrow entry opened up into a larger chamber, the first major room of the cave, roughly 300 square feet, with ceilings rising between 8 to 11 feet high. The air was cool and still, carrying the sharp scent of whetstone. Soft beams from their helmet lights swept across the walls, revealing twisting mineral veins and small ledges slick with condensation. This was a safe space to regroup, breathe, and prepare for the tighter paths ahead. Inside the main room of the cave, Donald positioned himself on the east side, while Jim took charge of the west, keeping a watchful eye on the boys. From this central chamber, several smaller tunnels branched out in all directions, but not all were charted. Some might lead deeper into the cave system. Others could be dead ends or dangerously narrow. Donald spotted a passage near his side of the room, a narrow opening. He wasn't sure if it connected to a known section of the cave or if it would simply dead end, but it looked promising enough to check. He planned to scout it quickly, then return to tell the boys whether it was safe to explore. At 5'11" and 160 pounds, Donald was slim enough to squeeze into tighter spaces. His sons, Christopher and Roger, followed behind, ready to relay news of his findings to Jim and the rest of the group. As Donald inched forward, the walls closed in around him, pressing in on his sides. The passage was just 18 inches high by 20 inches wide, tight but not impossible. He couldn't lift his head much to look ahead, and his arms were pinned slightly back, but he kept moving by pulling himself forward with slow, steady effort. The floor was coated in slick mud, which made movement easier until it didn't. As he crawled around a gentle bend to the right, Donald suddenly felt the ground vanish beneath him. He slid downward without warning, mud rushing under him like a chute. He hadn't fallen far, only a few feet, but he had landed in the worst possible spot, a keyhole-shaped crevice that narrowed into a 5-inch wide wedge at the bottom. "Stop!" Donald called back to them, his voice strained but calm. He tried to push himself up, but the angle of the tunnel was against him. It sloped downward at about 30 degrees, and the mud was so slippery he couldn't get any grip. His arms were pinned tightly at his sides, wedged by the narrowing rock, and gravity pulled his body deeper into the crevice with every slight movement. He couldn't see forward. He couldn't move back. Still calm, but now more focused, Donald called back to Christopher. "Grab my feet. See if you can pull me back a little." Inside the narrow tunnel, Christopher crouched and tried to get a hold of his dad's mud-caked shoes, but the tight walls made it nearly impossible to get a strong grip. The air was damp and heavy, and every attempt left Donald deeper in the crack. After several failed tries, Donald finally told his sons to back out of the tunnel and find Scoutmaster Jim. The boys were clearly worried, but they believed that with an adult's help, their dad would be free in no time. Jim crawled into the tunnel, moving slowly through the tight squeeze until he saw Donald's legs sticking out awkwardly around a bend. His body was angled downward at a steep 30 degrees, wedged tightly in the narrow space. Jim grabbed hold of Donald's legs and pulled, but the result was immediate and alarming. "It's getting tighter," Donald called out, his voice straining. Each time Jim pulled, the pressure increased. Donald could feel the tunnel walls clamp down on his ribs. But the moment Jim let go, his body would slide forward again, slipping deeper into the wedge. After a few tries, it became clear that this was not a simple fix. The tunnel itself seemed to work against them. It narrowed sharply to just 18 inches, and Jim could barely reach Donald's boots. It was hard to believe that Donald had made it this far forward, but now he couldn't go back an inch. Donald explained what had gone wrong. "When I slid in, some of the rocks must have shifted. Now they're wedging me in. Every time you pull me back, they shift forward and trap me worse." There was no room to adjust his arms. He couldn't lift his chest. He couldn't turn his head. And just beyond his shoulders, the tunnel tightened down to a terrifying 5 inches. A stone funnel with no exit. Jim was shaken, realizing this was beyond what either of them could solve alone. He began the long, awkward crawl backward, out of the tunnel, and once free, he called for help. By the time emergency services were alerted, nearly 3 hours had passed since Donald had first become trapped. He hadn't moved an inch. Local police issued a call for specialized cave rescue teams. This wasn't a situation that could be solved with ropes and brute force. The tunnel was too narrow, just enough space for one person at a time to reach Donald's legs. The rescue teams quickly got to work. Their first idea was to rig up ropes and try pulling Donald free from the tight passage. But even with the combined strength of several people, it only made things worse. Donald's body wedged deeper under the ledge and rock that had locked him in. Every tug increased the pressure. The rescuers couldn't even reach the rock that had trapped him, and Donald's arms were pinned to his sides, making it impossible for him to help. When it became clear that pulling wouldn't work, they brought in chisels and small jackhammers, hoping to chip away at the surrounding rock. But the tunnel was so narrow, so twisted, that working in it was agonizingly slow. Rescuers could only enter one at a time, laying sideways, shoulders hunched, tools held at odd angles. For hours, little progress was made. Teams rotated in and out, each spending time beside Donald, trying to help in any way they could. They set up a heat lamp near his feet, passed in warm water bottles, and tried to keep his legs from going numb. They spoke gently, letting Donald know they weren't giving up. But Donald could feel the seriousness of the situation. He lay there, arms pinned, body pressed beneath a slab of rock that had fallen from the ceiling. He was cold, he was thirsty, but worst of all, no one could reach his upper body. They couldn't offer him food, water, or even touch his hand. At one point, Donald quietly asked, "Can someone please call my wife? Let her know I'll be late tonight." The hours dragged on. Stuck in a space no wider than 5 inches, Donald could think, breathe, and speak, but he could not move. It was a slow-motion nightmare, and he had nothing to do but lie in the dark and think about how he ended up here. Some of the cave experts who knew the crooked swamp system had a different idea. They remembered that another tunnel, Cave 2, ran close to where Donald was trapped. Maybe, just maybe, they could reach him from the other side. They made their way through that separate cave and found a narrow passage that seemed to link up, but it was barely wide enough for a child, let alone a fully grown rescuer. Then came a small beam of hope. 2 sisters, Lynn and Nancy Taylor, joined the rescue. They weren't just experienced cavers, they were lifelong explorers, raised by cave-exploring parents and members of the National Cave Rescue Commission. More importantly, they were tiny, perfectly suited for the job. Nancy was 5 feet 2 inches and weighed 105 pounds. Lynn was even smaller, 5 feet tall and just 86 pounds. Lynn volunteered to go first. She wormed her way through the tight, winding tunnel of Cave 2, crawling on her stomach through a space no wider than a backpack. She finally reached the narrow crossover point, just 5 inches wide. She stretched her arm as far as she could, but she was still 2 feet away from reaching Donald's head. The twisted passage made it impossible. Her heart sank. They had been so close. But from this direction, there was simply no way to help him. No way to pass him water. No way to offer food. Not even a comforting hand. The window of time to save Donald was shrinking, and everyone knew it. All through Saturday night, the rescue teams worked non-stop. They tried everything: ropes, tools, pulling, pushing. But it was clear now. Donald couldn't be pulled backward, and he couldn't move forward. They had to come up with something new, and fast. With time running out, they called in a new type of rescue team, one that specialized in digging operations. The plan was simple but bold: dig straight through the rock, down to where Donald was trapped. All day Sunday they worked, pounding through dirt and rock to reach the narrow tunnel. By nightfall, they had dug downward to the right depth, but they were still 12 feet away from Donald's location. Now they had to dig sideways, hoping to break through and finally reach him. At this point, Donald had been stuck for 36 hours, angled head down in a tunnel just 5 inches wide. The cave was cold, only 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, and even worse, he was pressed against freezing stone. Warm air and hot water bottles had helped a little, but only his lower legs were reachable. That wasn't enough. Exposure to cold rock for hours is deadly. It sucks the heat right out of a person's body. And now, hypothermia was setting in. Around 2 a.m. Monday morning, a rescuer heard faint grunting sounds from the tunnel. Donald was still alive. That moment lit a fire in the team. They worked even harder, digging laterally, closer and closer. By sunrise, they were near. But then they hit a wall of bedrock, impossibly hard stone that couldn't be chipped away easily. It was heartbreaking. Donald had been in that cold stone prison for nearly 2 full days. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't had a sip of water, and now his core body temperature was dangerously low. A nurse crawled into the main tunnel with a Doppler machine and an EKG to check for signs of life. She pressed the devices to his legs, but unable to get a pulse. It wouldn't be a definite confirmation of whether he was still alive, because a person's core organs can continue functioning even after their arms and legs stop by showing a pulse. But it was a very bad sign. Faced with the possibility that his life was slipping away, the team made a tough choice. They brought in the most extreme tools they had: dynamite, a backhoe. It was risky. The cave could collapse, but if they didn't reach him now, they never would. On Tuesday morning, they finally broke through to where Donald was. A doctor crawled into the narrow passage and confirmed what everyone had feared. Donald Wellner had died. After 72 hours of cold, pressure, and isolation, his body had simply reached its limit. The doctor believed he had survived at least 36 hours and maybe as long as 48 before hypothermia took his life. Even in death, the rescue wasn't over. It took another full day to recover Donald's body. The passage was jagged, too narrow for easy movement. Ropes and slings had to be carefully arranged to pull him out without making the cave more unstable. In total, 150 people were involved in the effort. They worked tirelessly for 80 hours. They were determined to bring Donald home. It was a freak accident. One narrow slide, one unlucky shift of rock. After Donald's death, the cave system was sealed to the public. A local conservancy group now allows access only to certified, experienced cavers, and only through recognized caving organizations. Donald Wellner's story remains a haunting reminder of how unforgiving nature can be, especially deep underground, where one wrong move can change everything.